I'm Rob Higgins. I'm going to be chairing the session, and I'm part of the team who've been setting up this workshop. But mainly the work has been undertaken by Dan Prokop and Fumi Kitagawa. So I'm very grateful to them, and we're working on this initiative. And as part of this, we're also putting together an edited book as well. So we're working on an edited volume. I think with a number of you are online at the moment. We got a proposal with a publisher at this moment in time, and we're waiting to get feedback from them. They've sent it out for review, which is good news, and hopefully we can update you on where we're at with that by the end of the workshop period. So we've got 4 speakers today from across Europe and North America. We're going to kick off with Rhiannon Pugh from Lund, but originally from Wales, and originally studied at Cardiff University as well in Cambridge. We've got Ben Spiegel from Edinburgh University, Shiri Bresnitz from Toronto, and I'm going to be finishing off with a presentation as well to round things off. Just in terms of the housekeeping, we've got about 25 minutes for each session. So we're thinking about 15 minutes for the presentation, around 10 minutes for question and answers. If you'd like to ask questions, just use the raise your hand in Zoom, which I think you've got to press the reaction and then raise your hand, and hopefully I'll see that and get to you now. So I think that's just about it in terms of the opening. So we can I can hand over to Rhiannon for the first presentation.
Great, thanks very much, Rob, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation to speak today. I wish I could be there with you in Cardiff, but we have to wait till another time. Yeah, so the talk that I'm giving today, what I wanted to do was introduce you to some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, which came out last year in the form of an edited book, which hopefully you can see the title on here, but it's published by Edward Elgar, and it's called Entrepreneurial Ecosystems Meets Innovation Systems. And basically the premise for this was to try and link up a couple of diverse but interconnected bodies of literature, namely this new, slightly more buzzy entrepreneurial ecosystems concept that lots of people have been talking about for the last decade or so, with more established innovation systems body of work. And what I'm going to talk about today is, in particular, 2 elements that we think might be useful in terms of going back to innovation systems thinking, which is contextual and evolutionary perspectives. And this work has been done a number of different things with Jana and Alexandra, who aren't here today, but I've put a picture so they're with us in spirit, and I couldn't have done any of this work without them. Yeah, so part of what we were thinking was, just this kind of reconsidering entrepreneurial ecosystems by going back to some sort of older, in a sense, theory, whether this was a useful thing to do and what it could teach us. And it kind of sparked some conversations about, why do we always have to do new things, come up with new theories, come up with new ideas? You know, is it valuable sometimes to step back and look at some older concepts and what they can teach us about new concepts? So I guess it's kind of a reflection on doing that kind of work with regards to entrepreneurial ecosystems. Just a broader packet of work really that I've been working on with Jana and Alex, one of which has been a special issue in Local Economy Journal, which came out last year, and we're currently just finalizing another one at Growth and Change Journal. And the idea of those was to do some broadening really of the entrepreneurial ecosystem concept, and to proactively try and get contributions from colleagues all around the world. And we sort of use the GlobalX network a bit to do this, which some of you might know is quite a long-standing sort of innovation studies, innovation systems community. And we managed to get a lot of different people involved. And if you look at these special issues, there are publications from Latin America, South Africa, Europe, one from India. So it's a really nice range of different interrogations, really, of entrepreneurial ecosystems and innovation systems. I'm sure you all know your kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem definitions anyway, But the part that really stood out to us is the way of understanding entrepreneurship as evolutionary, socially interactive, and non-linear, which speaks a lot really to the kind of previous systems of innovation thinking. And I was just reading before this session, I was catching up on the paper that just come out in, what was it? Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, by some of the people who were here today, I think. And they were also sort of drawing these parallels to some of these earlier modes of thinking, not only systems of innovation, but some other ones. But systems of innovation was the one we sort of focused on because it was the one we knew. And this is sort of a thinking that goes back a lot earlier and was established by Freeman in particular, but also Lund, and Nelson. I expect lots of you are familiar with this body of work, although you might not have sort of returned to it for a few years. But it drew on sort of even early ideas from sort of List, Marx, Schumpeter. So we were quite interested in trying to link up these different bodies of literature, the older and the newer, to see what they could learn from each other. Like I said, they're already pretty similar because they consider actors and institutions, and they both can be used at different geographical levels, such as local, regional, or national. But obviously entrepreneurial ecosystems is more focused on sort of entrepreneurship as a driver of growth, innovation systems more on innovation. However, if you go back to that sort of Schumpeterian understanding that you can't understand one without the other, and they're sort of two sides of the same coin, it kind of makes sense to bring them together in analysis. So yeah, maybe this last point is a little bit harsh given the paper that's just been published, where I think Ben was involved in writing that one, and Eric Stamm, and I can't remember exactly now. Sorry if I missed anyone. Which actually does go back through some of the past approaches it draws on, but generally I don't think it's been very good at or recognizing this, and a lot of the links to earlier literature might have been quite implicit rather than explicit, with a few exceptions to that rule. Yeah, but the things that we thought could be particularly valuable that is quite prominent in the older innovation system literature was the issue of context specificity, but also evolutionary dynamics. And those are really the two things that we thought that entrepreneurial ecosystems could have more of, and other people have highlighted this as well, that it can be sometimes lacking in these areas. Often context sort of gets assumed. Entrepreneurial ecosystems writing is often very place-based, but often that kind of place-basedness, if you like, is kind of taken for granted and not necessarily conceptualized as how that is applicable when you change context, for instance. And it has been getting a lot more mixed in terms of the context where it has been applied in the last couple of years. But generally speaking, it's founded on quite a narrow range of cases, which is part of why we did some of the special issues to try and address that. There have already been calls, as we know, for more evolutionary dynamics. Probably the Mack and Mayer paper is the big one calling for that. And actually, evolutionary economics, as you probably know, is one of the key feed-ins to innovation system thinking. Thus, it kind of has a lot to say about that. And these are just some examples of the kind of quite commonly used examples, such as cities in North America, Edinburgh, Scotland, in the kind of earlier work. And we actually felt like entrepreneurial ecosystems, kind of as an academic community, but also theoretically, could learn a bit from innovation systems debates, because those really spread quite globally. If you look at work on innovation systems, there was a lot of comparing different countries with the regional innovation systems work, comparing different regions, and looking at how different systems evolved, how they did in different ways. Although entrepreneurial ecosystems has had the global north bias, this is actually changing quite rapidly, and there's much more work now being published from diverse contexts, looking at, how might entrepreneurial ecosystems function in, for instance, resource-constrained environments, or where there's a high incidence of necessity entrepreneurship or bottom of the pyramid entrepreneurship discussions coming from Latin America, for example. But what I was reflecting on, especially when reading this piece, Bernd was the other person who wrote it, of course, was that how much of that work is actually feeding back into our theorizing of EEs. There's a lot of stuff out there if you look for diverse context of entrepreneurial ecosystems, but as that paper showed, still the stuff that's getting cited and sort of regurgitated when we write about it is not always so well represented. So is that diverse body of work being read and cited enough? It's kind of an open question. And if you feel like there is more to be done there, then you can take a look at some of the special issues that we have been doing, which are contributing with case studies from, for instance, Colombia, Andrea and Jana's paper, a paper that I was lucky enough to work on thanks to some colleagues at Cardiff Metropolitan Region looking at Oman. And there are different contributions on, for instance, India, and like I said, quite a lot coming from Latin America as well. And the other aspect really is the evolutionary perspective and the importance of time. And we know from entrepreneurial ecosystem work, which itself recognizes that this is lacking. You know, perhaps there's more chance to work with our colleagues from economic history, for example, who can add that perspective as well. And one thing that we were struck by when we looked at the older innovation system literature is often it is looking at these really long timescales, like the evolution of national innovation systems over time in different places, you know, looking at Germany from the post-war eras to the 90s and Japan, which when we look at it with today's eyes looks quite slow, you know, the kind of the length of time that these studies were taking place for, to see these longer trends and piece together this work over a long period of time, which probably could provide some challenges for us working in the modern academic environment to kind of take on board this fully evolutionary perspective, I guess. So that's just some examples of that from the work, the kind of classic work from Freeman, where he does this very longitudinal perspective, but also comparing what's happening in different systems that I think, you know, we could learn a bit from by going back and reconsidering, especially those of us who maybe read it a long time ago and put it in a drawer and haven't looked at since. But then I suppose sort of open question, like, is that what we should be doing? Is that what we want to be doing? We had the idea that returning to old literature could be something insightful, something interesting to do. But maybe we're kind of, you know, refusing to move with the times or not embracing the new enough. And then I was just reflecting on it based on a discussion about 2 weeks ago. Roberta Rabelotti and Simona Yamarino were tweeting about an event about meet the foremost innovation scholars of our time. And if you look in the theory and foundation section, it's like an 11-man panel. So if we want to kind of diversify the literature that we read and cite, which I think there's probably interest to do in the EE community, maybe we take a step backwards by going back to some of this older work. It was just sort of something that struck me when I saw that image at the same time that I was writing a paper that's currently under review, just been submitted, that was about going back and using old literature. And we'd had a discussion while we were writing it. Gosh, a lot of this old literature is these kind of old white guys or something. It came out on Twitter and everyone was talking about it. And it really struck it home with like an image that actually there are some problematic things when we go back to more classic literature in terms of, yeah, who we cite and who we read and stuff. So I think it's kind of an open question. Is it good to go back to the past, or should we keep pushing forward and moving forward and allow entrepreneurial ecosystems to break from old literatures and start again? I thought that maybe this was something interesting that others might be interested in and also thinking about. But also I wanted to kind of highlight the work that we've done, especially with the book, trying to bridge these two concepts together and introduce you to that work if you hadn't sort of found it yet. And I'm done.
We can take some questions. Let's just see if we've got any, which we have. I'm going to start off with, okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Yeah, it was really great. And I grew up with sort of regional innovation sort of system literature. And then now sort of moving on to EE kind of community or colleagues. So I kind of feel like it's a bit of like life course sort of shift. But just kind of my question is, in terms of kind of policy inference or this innovation system, either national, regional or sectoral, it's been quite predominant. But I mean, EE communities also lots of conversation with policy, but I don't think it kind of makes, I don't know, there's lots of different levels of impact, but it's quite different from old kind of literature or communities. So I just wonder if you see, as you've sort of kind of see the gaps and bridging some of the gaps, if you see in terms of like a policy communication or policy engagement, if you see different sort of kind of Yeah, I don't know what is the kind of key difference. So is it different strategy or different strengths or weaknesses? Do you kind of observe something in there?
Yeah, I think the policy link is kind of interesting because I mean, there's been quite a lot of, I'm sure we've all seen work sort of either done by academics or published by the OECD about entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I know there's people that sit in the OECD who do work on entrepreneurial ecosystems. Actually, my co-author on the book, Alex, is one of them. She sits at the OECD in Trento. And I think that's quite interesting because I believe there might be people here who could correct me on the history of the field a bit better, but I believe like back, I don't know, I suppose it was about 20 years ago or so, 20, 30 years ago, Lund, for instance, who was one of the big national innovation system people, was sitting in OECD as well. So there seems to be some repeating going on in that sense of like the communities having that link at the OECD level. I think what's quite interesting with the innovation system stuff is how it spreads internationally, including to the global south, emerging economies, especially via that Global X network. And a lot of them are people who are academics, but they sit in, you know, Fundes, you know, the Brazilian Development Bank, or different organizations. Whereas I'm not sure whether the entrepreneurial ecosystem has had that kind of spread in the same way yet. I don't know what you think, Fumi. I know you've been doing a lot of work sort of internationally collaborating on the topic with colleagues in Japan, etc. And we experienced when we did these special issues, quite a lot of people from Latin America were working on these on the entrepreneurial ecosystem concept. But I don't know whether it's like actually made it into policy in the same way yet. But someone else might have a view on that who's more.
Yeah, we've had a question actually from Maxim and sort of related to that, thinking about the literature, thinking about the antecedents of the literature and about how far we should go back. And it is an interesting question, isn't it? You know, when you've sort of written yourself about it, Rhiannon, in a way, thinking about, you know, what they say, old wine in new bottles or whatever. What are your thoughts on that? And thinking about the geography as well, you know, mentioned some things about maybe, you know, in South America, etc. And it seems to me as if you mentioned about, you know, that there's been some traction for innovation systems in the global South, but in many ways, innovation systems, you know, has been something attached to the literature and to the policy within Europe. I would say there's less sort of traction within North America, where, you know, clusters obviously comes to mind. And it does seem to me, and there's a number of people online who've helped with this really, that have made the idea of entrepreneurial ecosystems become more, I guess, generic in thinking spatially as well, you know, across different areas.
I think it's an interesting question that Maxim poses. I was just kind of laughing because he asked a really difficult question after I gave him a shout out and put his paper up on the presentation. So, but I mean, I think, yeah, why stop, right? Why not go back as far as we want to or can in tracing back? I suppose at some point you go back to, like, I don't know, I guess the roots of social science or something like that. At which point, I suppose, where does it stop being about entrepreneurial ecosystems and where does it start being about, I don't know, deep questions of epistemology and ontology and all these things, which I'm probably not very well qualified to talk about. But Ben Spiegel has made a suggestion to go back to the work of Alexander von Humboldt. So maybe I'll just steal that one and say that we should go back to the work of von Humboldt. But yeah, the answer is I really don't know. I really don't know when we should stop. But I think it's a common theme in my work has been trying to look at how these ideas get kind of repurposed and repackaged. Like Rob says, as old wine in new bottles. And it's obviously something that occurs again and again. Probably not only in our discipline of kind of management, economic geography, regional studies, but I think we're probably quite guilty of it, of always kind of looking for something new and different and repackaging. So I suppose it was part of this drive was for me to ask if we should keep doing that so much, or whether we've been doing that a bit too much with all the kind of ideas that Rob mentioned.
We got another question from Dina.
Yes, hi. Well, I think I do agree, as Rhiannon, I think, did say, that to try to go and be original a little bit. And one of the things, to be honest, that I discovered recently was that the field of entrepreneurship in general is shifting from the role of entrepreneur to the focus on the organization, whether this is organization growth or organization development and learning and such things. And they're going far away from the focus on the role of entrepreneur. And this is one of the things that I loved about the ecosystem, that it made the focus come back to the entrepreneur. And one of the things, to be honest, that astonishes me in this field, that entrepreneurship has personality characteristics, cognition of entrepreneur, type of entrepreneur, that was provided by Schumpeter and Kerzner. And all of these are neglected in the national innovation systems, although the entrepreneur is the person who does it, not the firm. So I think what you're saying is very good to try to. I was reading 2 articles recently that are so much against the focus on the personality of the entrepreneur, although entrepreneur is to be honest, this is what made me interested in entrepreneurship ecosystem, is that he's the main focus of everything. So I think, really getting back to the original thought of Schumpeter, we should focus on the entrepreneur behavior, cognition. So I do agree on what you said, definitely, Rhiannon, so much. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. I also agree that this is like, yeah, this is what innovation systems is lacking a view on entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurial ecosystems is lacking a view on innovation. And Schumpeter was the one who first pointed out, I guess, maybe my economic history is probably not good, but as far as I know, he was the original one of pointing out the interconnection between these two things. So I suppose we should bear that in mind.
Any more questions or comments? Okay, well, if not, thanks again to Rhiannon. And
thank you for listening and all your questions.